Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are cracking the code of coffee. We're going to use the Coffee Cupper's Handbook as our guide to figure out how the pros taste and talk about every single cup.
So right off the bat, the handbook points out a huge problem. It's not you, it's our language. I mean, think about it. We've got tons of words to describe what something looks or sounds like. But when it comes to smell and taste, we're kind of left speechless. You've been there, right? You're staring at a bag of coffee with words like whiny or piquant or chocolatey. You know it's supposed to be a good thing, but what does that even mean? How do they get from a sip of brown liquid to a word like piquant?
Well, that's the code we're going to crack today. Here's our game plan. First, we'll learn the basic language of flavor. Then we'll decode aroma, map out taste, understand the feel, and finally, we'll see how the pros put it all together in a ritual called cupping.
Okay, before we dive deep, we need to get one fundamental rule straight. Seriously, this is the one principle that organizes everything else a professional taster does.
And here it is. It's actually pretty simple when you break it down. Flavor isn't just one thing. It's a team effort between three different senses: what we smell, what we taste, and what we feel. Gases for smell, liquids for taste, and, well, the other stuff for feel. It sounds basic, I know, but this little framework is incredibly powerful.
All right, let's tackle that first part of the code, olfaction, or, the science of smell. This is all about what makes coffee smell so ridiculously good before you even take that first sip. So let's go back to our rule. The only reason we can smell that amazing coffee aroma is because tiny, invisible compounds are literally flying off the coffee, turning into a gas, and shooting right up our nose. That's it. That's the science of aroma. Now, here's where we get a little fancy. See, professionals don't just talk about aroma as one thing. They talk about the coffee's bouquet, which is basically the entire aromatic story of that coffee, from start to finish. And that story has 4 parts. And it happens in this exact order. First up is the fragrance. That's the smell of the dry grounds themselves. Then you get the aroma, which is that big poof of smell when the hot water hits. Then comes the nose, which are the vapors that travel up the back of your throat as you're tasting. And finally, you get the aftertaste. Yep, that's an aroma too, that hangs around after you swallow. Pretty cool, huh?
So where do all these different smells actually come from? Well, they're not random. They basically come from 3 places. You've got enzymatic smells, which are the fruity, flowery notes that come from the coffee plant itself. Then there's sugar browning during roasting. That gives us all those yummy, nutty, and chocolatey smells. And last, you have dry distillation, which is the actual fiber of the bean getting toasted, creating those spicier, woodsy notes.
Okay, we've got the smell part down. Let's move on to the next piece of the flavor puzzle, gustation. In other words, what is happening on your tongue?
And we're back to our golden rule. For us to taste something, it has to dissolve in water. So with coffee, we're talking about all the flavor compounds that get extracted out of the grounds and into your cup when you brew it. Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. You know the basic tastes, right? Sweet, sour, salty. But professionals look at how these tastes combine to create new tastes. It's like mixing colors. For example, when you get the right mix of sweetness and acids in a coffee, it creates this whole new, amazing sensation they call acidity. And speaking of acids, get ready for a bit of a mythbuster. We always hear that coffee is super acidic, right? Well, if you actually look at the chemistry, it's one of the least acidic things we drink. Your morning orange juice or that can of cola? Way more acidic than your coffee.
Which brings us to this really crucial point. When a coffee taster calls a coffee acidy, that's a huge compliment. They're not talking about chemical acidity or pH levels. They're talking about that bright, sparkling, sweet taste you get when acids and sugars combine perfectly. So acidity is a good thing, a very good thing.
All right, we've covered what we smell and what we taste. So what's left? The last piece of the code is all about touch, or, how the coffee physically feels in your mouth. And this brings us right back to the third part of our big rule. We're talking about the stuff that doesn't turn into a gas and doesn't dissolve in the water. These are tiny particles and oils that are just kind of suspended in the liquid, and because of that, we don't smell them or taste them, we feel them. The pros have a word for this, and it's body. Body has nothing to do with flavor. It's all about texture. The weight, the richness, the oiliness of the coffee. The easiest way to think about it is the difference between skim milk and heavy cream. That feeling, that weight on your tongue, that's body.
And just like acidity and acidity get mixed up, people confuse body with strength all the time.
but they are totally different. Strength is about how intense the flavor is, how much stuff is dissolved in the water. Body is about the weight or texture from the stuff that isn't dissolved. So you can totally have a coffee with a big, heavy body that has a very delicate, gentle flavor.
Okay, so we've got our 3 pieces of the puzzle: the bouquet, the taste, and the body. Now let's see how the professionals use this whole framework to break down a coffee in a formal tasting process called cupping.
Check this out. This process lines up perfectly with everything we just learned. They go through these 6 steps in order. They start with fragrance and aroma to evaluate the bouquet. Then they slurp, and that crazy loud slurp is actually super important. It sprays the coffee all over your palate. That's how they assess the taste, the nose, and the aftertaste all at once. And finally, they think about the body. They're literally experiencing the coffee's whole story as it unfolds.
So the next time you see a bunch of fancy words on a coffee bag, you'll know it's not just marketing nonsense. It's a language, a code that's telling the story of that coffee, where it's from, how it was grown, how it was roasted. You've basically got the decoder ring now. So the only question is, what are you going to discover in your next cup?